Brookfield Greens, a quaint suburban community on the outskirts of an unnamed Midwest city, boasted manicured lawns, pristine driveways, and towering maples that lined both sides of the streets. With rows of neat, two-story homes showing off pastel shades of beige and pale blue, Brookfield Greens appeared to many as a postcard-worthy place. Safe, family-friendly, and well-organized. Behind this calm facade, however, lay a tightly run homeowners association, HOA. And behind the HOA's calm official letters and gentle-sounding guidelines, there lurked something far less serene. Certain members who believed their vision of order was paramount to anyone else's personal preference. Among these self-appointed stewards of neighborhood purity was a woman named Bernice Alderton, though almost everyone privately called her Karen. Karen was in her late 40s, a trim figure with impeccably styled hair that never seemed to move out of place. She took pride in being what she called a guardian of standards, but most residents recognized her for the harsh notices and citations she liberally handed out. She would take issue with a mismatched patch of paint, a lawn gnome she thought tacky, or a wreath that stayed on someone's door a few days past the holiday. Nothing escaped her gaze. Despite her reputation, Brookfield Greens still felt like a paradise for young families, especially those with small children. One such family, the Tanners, comprised of Martin Tanner, his wife Julie, and their spirited 3-year-old son Toby, moved into a cozy single-story house near the community's eastern edge. Their front yard had a modest flower bed and a side yard that caught the evening sun, an ideal place for Toby's favorite outdoor toy, a small plastic sandbox shaped like a friendly turtle. When the Tanners moved in, they had no inkling of the trouble that would brew. Toby's sandbox, which brought him squeals of joy, would soon become a source of anger for an HOA official determined to keep the neighborhood's walkways neat and child-free. The chaos that followed would ripple through Brookfield Greens, challenging neighbors to confront Karen's tyranny, and ironically leading to an even bigger sandbox than Toby could have ever dreamed. On a bright summer morning, Toby sat cross-legged in his turtle-shaped sandbox, scooping and shaping the store-bought play sand into mounds. Martin watched him from the window, smiling at his son's delight. Julie was in the kitchen finishing up breakfast dishes, occasionally glancing out to make sure Toby stayed within view. Living at Brookfield Greens had been pleasant enough for the Tanners so far. Quiet nights, friendly nods from neighbors, and reliable trash pickup. The couple had received a copy of the HOA's covenant, a thick binder of regulations, but had only skimmed it. After all, they had no intentions of violating any rules. Their lawn was well kept, and they followed the standard guidelines for paint color and mailbox style. But that same morning, while Toby was happily playing, Karen made her daily patrol. She strolled with a clipboard in hand, looking for any perceived infractions. When she spotted Toby's sandbox close to the sidewalk, her lips pressed into a tight line. She disliked kids cluttering community spaces, and in her mind, the bright green sandbox was an eyesore that broke the uniform aesthetic. She marched up to Martin, who was now stepping outside to water a row of geraniums. "Good morning," she said in a clipped voice. "I see your little one loves playing in the sandbox." Martin smiled warmly. "He does. Perfect weather for outdoor fun." Karen's gaze settled on the bits of sand that had spilled onto the grass, as well as onto the walkway a few feet away. "Are you aware," she began, "that debris, like sand, strewn onto common areas can create a hazard or a mess for others?" Martin, slightly taken aback, looked down at the minimal spillage. "Oh, we make sure to sweep up if anything goes onto the sidewalk." He pointed to a small broom on the porch. "Toby's only 3. He can be messy, but we try to keep things tidy." Karen sniffed, clearly unimpressed. "I must remind you that under Section 8.4 of the Brookfield Greens HOA guidelines, homeowners are responsible for ensuring any personal play equipment remains within the boundaries of their property and doesn't impose on communal areas." Before Martin could reply, Karen made a note on her clipboard and walked off, her heels clicking on the pavement. Martin shrugged, thinking it was a mild warning. At worst, he might have to relocate the sandbox another foot from the sidewalk. Little did he know, this was only a glimpse of the conflict brewing. Karen believed a perfect neighborhood was one free of clutter, noise, or evidence of undisciplined children. She wasn't a parent herself, and though she claimed to love kids, her every action suggested otherwise. She wanted lawns uniform, flower beds symmetrical, and sidewalks clear of toys, chalk drawings, or anything that hinted at spontaneous childhood play. Her position within the HOA was not the president. Rather, she held the role of compliance coordinator, an unofficial title she had bestowed upon herself. Technically, the HOA had a president, a treasurer, and a small volunteer committee. But Karen managed to insert herself into every aspect of enforcement. Neighbors frequently found friendly reminders typed in bold letters and slipped under doors, courtesy of Karen. If that didn't work, she resorted to formal violation notices, citing obscure paragraphs from the thick HOA covenant. Some people tried to reason with her, to no avail. Others paid the fines or removed the offending items, just to avoid her relentless follow-ups. Now that Toby's Turtle Sandbox had caught Karen's eye, she was determined to enforce her brand of cleanliness. The next day, she returned to the Tanner's house, only to see Toby once again happily scooping sand. She noticed a thin line of fine grains along the sidewalk's edge. Evidence, she thought. That evening, Martin found a notice in his mailbox. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Tanner, we have observed that the children's sandbox on your property may pose a risk of sand spilling onto the communal walkway. As a reminder, all personal play equipment must be kept sufficiently far from neighborhood common areas to avoid any potential hazard. Kindly rectify this situation to maintain our high standards at Brookfield Greens. Sincerely, Karen Alderton. Brookfield Greens, HOA Compliance. Martin frowned at the letter, annoyed by the bureaucratic tone, but still wanting to stay on good terms. He dutifully moved the sandbox a foot farther from the sidewalk. We'll see if that makes her happy, he told Julie. Hopefully, this is the end of it. But the next morning, Toby, in his typical toddler way, carried little handfuls of sand everywhere he went. A small sprinkling ended up on the grass near the sidewalk anyway. Karen happened to walk by again. Her frustration deepened. She was convinced the Tanners weren't taking her instructions seriously enough. While Karen centered her attention on the Tanners, other residents of Brookfield Greens were dealing with their own run-ins. A retiree named Mr. Fletcher received a citation because his birdbath was deemed too large, while the Rodriguez family was told their front yard basketball hoop blocked aesthetic flow. In hushed whispers, neighbors commiserated about Karen's overreach. I don't understand what her problem is with kids, said Susan Holmes, a mother of two. She left a note on my door last month because my daughters drew chalk flowers on the sidewalk. She called it visual clutter. Martin, who was still new to the neighborhood, appreciated the sympathetic ear from these neighbors. I'm worried about Toby's sandbox, he admitted. It's not like we're letting trash blow around. It's clean, it's contained. I sweep up daily. Susan shook her head, exasperated. Karen doesn't care. If she sees anything outside her vision of order, she demands it goes. Despite the rumblings of discontent, few were brave enough to stand up to Karen openly. She had a knack for finding obscure technicalities in the HOA covenant and slapping violators with fines that most people found too time-consuming to dispute. The neighborhood's official board sometimes reined her in, but many board members preferred a quiet life over a confrontation, so Karen generally ran unchecked. The Tanners soon received another letter, this time threatening a formal penalty if sand continued to spill outside the sandbox. Martin read it aloud, frustration evident in his tone. Notice of potential fine, Brookfield Greens HOA. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Tanner, it has come to our attention for the third time that sand is being tracked onto the communal walkway from your child's sandbox. The HOA takes cleanliness and neighborhood safety seriously. Failure to keep personal play areas from encroaching on public spaces may result in a fine of up to $50 per day. We trust you will address this matter promptly to uphold the standards that make Brookfield Greens a desirable community. Karen Alderton, Compliance Coordinator. Julie threw up her hands. What does she expect us to do? Build a moat. Toby is 3. He's going to carry sand around. She gestured out the window at their tidy yard and the carefully placed sandbox. We're doing our best. Martin sighed. I guess we'll just keep sweeping, Maybe put a small outdoor rug next to the sandbox so Toby can shake off before heading on the grass. They tried the rug idea. It worked somewhat, but Karen still found faint traces of sand or witnessed Toby toddling around. She sent photos to Martin's email, highlighting single grains of sand on the walkway with red circles drawn in a paint program. The pettiness was unbelievable, but the Tanners didn't want a formal citation on their record. They complied, readjusting the sandbox location every few days, hoping it would appease Karen's demands. Karen's obsession grew. Each time she passed the Tanner's home, the sight of Toby playing happily made her blood pressure rise. In her mind, children belonged in designated playgrounds, preferably ones well away from her pristine sidewalks. She believed having a child's sandbox so close to a walkway was encouraging disorder. She also despised the squeals of delight Toby would let out, or the occasional neighbor stopping to interact with him. The sidewalk, she believed, was for walking, not for pausing to admire a toddler's sandcastle. Her frustration reached a breaking point late one evening. Looking out her window, she saw in the moonlight that Toby's sandbox was left outside, with its plastic lid ajar. Karen thought about the upcoming HOA inspection. She wanted her block to look especially immaculate. If only that sandbox were gone. She considered filing additional complaints, but she worried the HOA board might start questioning her personal vendetta. A sly idea formed in her mind. If the sandbox became unusable, maybe the Tanners would get rid of it themselves. She recalled a corner of her backyard where she had extra soil piled up from an old gardening project. If she dumped that soil all over the sandbox, making it a muddy, gritty mess, perhaps Toby would lose interest. Maybe Martin and Julie would throw it away. Street dust is enough mess for them. They don't need a sandbox, she thought bitterly. Thus, Karen's plan was set in motion. A few nights later, well past midnight, Karen donned black sweatpants, a hoodie, and gardening gloves. She tiptoed to the back of her property, grabbing a shovel and a wheelbarrow. With each scoop of soil, her heart pounded. She felt a rush of adrenaline, part guilt, part exhilaration. She was convinced she was doing the neighborhood a favor, protecting it from unsightly children's mess. Her plan was simple. Wool the soil to the Tanner's side yard, dump it into the sandbox, and scatter enough dirt around to make it look like an abandoned patch of mud, not worth salvaging. She pushed the wheelbarrow quietly along the sidewalk, the only sound being the faint squeak of its wheel. Reaching the Tanner's yard, she paused. The house was dark. Toby's sandbox, shaped like a happy green turtle, sat innocently under the faint glow of a nearby street lamp. Karen breathed in, then slowly emptied a heavy load of soil onto the sand. The plop of dirt hitting plastic made her wince, but she carried on. After 2 trips with the wheelbarrow, the sandbox was smothered. She used the shovel to spread the soil evenly, ensuring no visible traces of the original golden sand remained. Instead, it now looked like a dark mound of gritty dirt, completely unappealing for a toddler. Exhilarated and slightly panicked, Karen abandoned the scene, leaving behind scattered chunks of soil around the yard. She snuck back to her home, quietly returning the wheelbarrow. As she closed her shed door, she reassured herself. Now they'll see how messy and impractical that sandbox is and get rid of it for good. Sunlight dawned on Brookfield greens, filtering through the branches of the maple trees. Birds chirped as families started their routines. Julie Tanner was the first to notice the sabotage when she stepped outside to grab the morning paper. She let out a startled cry. The turtle's sandbox was barely recognizable. Its bright green rim was caked with mud, and the once pristine sand was buried under dark lumps of clumpy soil. Bits of dirt formed trails around the yard, as though someone had intentionally trampled the area. "Toby's going to be heartbroken," she said aloud. Hands pressed to her cheeks. She called for Martin, who came running. They both stared at the ruined sandbox in disbelief. An immediate knot of fear formed in Martin's stomach. If someone was bold enough to walk onto their property in the dead of night, what else might they do? He glanced at the sidewalk and noticed a trail of faint wheel marks leading from their yard to the direction of Karen's house. The tracks weren't obvious, but they were there. "Karen," he muttered under his breath. They alerted the police, filing a report for vandalism. An officer arrived, took photos, and asked questions. However, with no cameras capturing the act and no direct witness, the police couldn't definitively accuse anyone. They recommended the Tanners install motion sensor lights and perhaps a security camera. Shaken, Martin and Julie agreed to consider it. Later, little Toby toddled out, eyes widening at the sight of his beloved sandbox. "What happened?" he asked in a small voice. Julie tried to sound reassuring. "Someone made a big mess, sweetie. We'll fix it soon." But in her heart, she felt angry and violated. News of the Sandbox vandalism spread quickly through Brookfield Greens. Many residents were outraged, especially those with children. They suspected Karen, but no one had the proof. Still, whispered conversations around mailboxes and in driveways revealed a shared sentiment. Karen had gone too far. A group of dads from the neighborhood, who often chatted while washing cars or mowing lawns, decided it was time to push back. They organized a casual get-together in Martin Tanner's driveway to discuss a solution. Among them were Mike Henderson, father of 2, Carlos Rodriguez, with 3 kids, and Drew Collier, no kids, but plenty of sympathy for those harassed by Karen. Julie served lemonade as the men brainstormed. "We can't let whoever did this scare us into ditching the sandbox," Mike Henderson said, leaning against his SUV. "Kids have a right to play." "But Toby's little turtle box is ruined," Martin responded glumly. "It's full of dirt and who knows what else." Carlos Rodriguez had a spark in his eye. "What if we build something bigger and better? Something Karen can't sabotage without making it obvious?" Drew nodded. "You mean like a larger sandbox, but somewhere more visible? Maybe we get official HOA permission or turn it into a community feature." A buzz of excitement filled the group. If they created a covered sandbox in the community garden area, it would be an official amenity open to all kids in Brookfield Greens. The HOA would have to sign off on it, making it something Karen couldn't easily destroy without facing the entire board's wrath. "That might not be easy," Martin cautioned. "We'll have to get support. But if we do it right, gather enough signatures, present it as a neighborhood improvement, Karen's just one voice." The group decided to share their plan with other residents, gather enthusiastic support, and place it on the HOA meeting agenda. In the meantime, Martin promised Toby a brand new sandbox experience, bigger and better than before. A week later, the monthly HOA meeting took place in a modest clubhouse near the community entrance. A dozen or so board members and committee chairs sat at the head table, with Karen among them, clipboard in hand, scanning the assembled residents for any sign of trouble. Martin Tanner, accompanied by Mike, Carlos, and several other parents, took the floor when the meeting opened for new proposals. Martin cleared his throat, nerves jangling a bit. "Good evening. I'd like to propose a new community amenity, a covered sandbox located in the open grassy area of our central garden." He handed out printed copies of a simple design plan. "We'd build a wooden enclosure, fill it with safe, clean sand, and add shade sails overhead to protect kids from the sun. We'd maintain it ourselves, no cost to the HOA, aside from initial approvals." Karen's eyebrows shot up. She leaned over to whisper something to the HOA president, but he waved for Martin to continue. A few residents clapped quietly, especially those with kids who'd heard about Toby's sandbox being vandalized. Carlos chimed in. "This would give children a dedicated space to play. It keeps sand away from individual sidewalks, so there's no risk of spillage into communal areas." He shot a knowing glance at Karen. The HOA president, Mr. Caldwell, nodded thoughtfully. "That's an interesting idea, Mr. Tanner. We have a budget for minor community improvements. I see you're offering volunteer labor for construction, correct?" "Yes," Martin replied. "Several of us can handle the build. We have a local business that's willing to donate some materials. Plus, we'll file for any necessary permits with the city." Before Mr. Caldwell could respond, Karen interjected. "I have concerns. A sandbox is messy by nature. It could attract pests. It might become an eyesore if not properly covered or if sand is tracked everywhere." Mike Henderson rose. "We plan on using a specially designed cover system so the sand stays clean and contained. It'll be more controlled than any individual backyard setup. Karen pursed her lips. There's still the matter of noise. You can't deny the potential for screaming children disturbing the tranquility. Several residents stirred uncomfortably. A few whispered remarks like, "It's a neighborhood, not a retirement village," or "Kids have to play somewhere." The tension was palpable. Mr. Caldwell mediated. "All valid points. We'll put to a vote. If the majority of the board and the residents here support it, we'll move forward. Those in favor of the Community Sandbox project, please raise your hands." Hands shot up around the room. Karen's remained conspicuously down. The motion passed with overwhelming support. Karen's face betrayed her frustration, but she said nothing more. She jotted notes on her clipboard, her lips pressed so tightly they almost disappeared. Bolstered by the HOA's official go-ahead, the residents wasted no time. Within days, a group of volunteer dads and moms gathered at the designated patch of land in the community garden. They staked out the perimeter for a large wooden sandbox, roughly 12 feet by 12 feet, plenty of space for multiple children. Local businesses chipped in. A hardware store donated lumber at cost, a landscaper supplied a pallet of sand at a discount, and the tanners contributed the shade sails they'd found online. Even Toby got in on the excitement, toddling around in a little construction hat, offering plastic toy hammers to anyone who would take one. His delight over a new sandbox experience was clear, even if he didn't fully understand how it was going to replace his old turtle box. A spirit of camaraderie took hold. Neighbors who rarely spoke before found themselves chatting over the hum of an electric drill or the thud of a hammer. "We should do this kind of thing more often," Susan Holmes remarked as she handed out sandwiches. "It's a nice change from everyone hiding in their own yards." Even those without kids helped, eager to show solidarity or just enjoy a day in the sunshine. In the background, Karen occasionally peered from afar, arms folded, her expression chilly. She made no move to assist, and no one asked her to. As with any community project, there were hiccups. On the second day of construction, a sudden thunderstorm sent everyone scrambling for cover, leaving partially assembled wooden frames soaked overnight. Some nails rusted, a few boards warped. The group had to replace materials, testing their resolve. Karen used the delay to spread doubts, whispering to a few board members, "Look, it's already causing problems. Rotting wood, potential for mold." However, the parents and volunteers remained determined. They regrouped once the skies cleared, reinforcing the structure with water-resistant wood sealant. Little by little, the sandbox took shape, a sturdy, rectangular frame with wooden benches around the perimeter so parents could sit while children played. Above it, tall posts rose to support the triangular shade sails. Each piece was anchored securely into the ground, ensuring a safe, stable environment. When the day finally came to pour in the sand, Toby watched with wide eyes as a small truck offloaded a clean, fine-grain mix. The kids in the neighborhood cheered, practically dancing around the growing pile of sand. Buckets and shovels appeared, and within minutes, children were already shaping small sand hills. Karen, observing from the sidewalk, wore a tight-lipped frown. It was happening. The messy play area was official and unstoppable. She turned abruptly and headed home. A week later, the official community sandbox was deemed complete. To celebrate, the HOA organized a modest ribbon-cutting ceremony. Mr. Caldwell gave a short speech about neighbors coming together to enhance Brookfield greens for families. Martin Tanner was invited to say a few words, thanking everyone for their generosity and hard work. Karen stood at the back, arms crossed, listening with a neutral expression. When the crowd applauded, she clapped slowly and unenthusiastically. Yet even she could not deny the final structure looked polished, with the neat shade sails and carefully raked sand that stayed well within the sandbox's borders. In a rare moment, Karen approached Martin afterward. "It looks well constructed," she admitted stiffly. "I just hope you all maintain it properly, or else I'll have to file a complaint." Martin forced a polite smile. "We've got a maintenance schedule. A few of us will check it weekly to keep it clean and safe." Karen nodded curtly, saying nothing more. She walked away, heels clicking on the pavement. It was hardly an amicable truce, but at least for the moment, open hostilities seemed to pause. The next few weeks felt like a renaissance in Brookfield Greens. Families flocked to the new Sandbox, and children no longer had to confine themselves to tiny yard spaces. Friendships blossomed as parents chatted on the benches. Older kids helped younger ones build sand castles or dig tunnels. Even a few childless couples strolled by to watch the happy chaos, some enjoying the sense of life and energy it brought. The Sandbox became a social hub. Weekend potlucks sprang up spontaneously around it. Neighbors would set up small folding tables of snacks, while kids played just steps away. It was as though the entire community had found a new focal point for social interaction, something it had lacked before. Meanwhile, Toby thrived. His heartbreak over the ruined Turtle's Sandbox faded, replaced by excitement over a vast new play space. Martin and Julie often reflected on the irony that Karen's Sabotage had galvanized such a positive, collaborative project. They never confronted Karen directly about the vandalism. Without proof, it seemed pointless to escalate. The important thing was that Toby had a place to play, bigger and better than before. Despite the outward harmony, Karen privately fumed. Every day, she passed by the bustling Sandbox, irritated by the noise and constant presence of children. She tried searching for ways to undermine the project, perhaps a code violation or a safety infraction. But the structure had been built meticulously, using officially approved materials, and it complied with every relevant guideline. She took photos of children leaving small footprints on the grass, hoping to label it property damage. However, the HOA board dismissed her concerns, pointing out that a bit of foot traffic was normal. Karen emailed the city's parks department about potential issues, but was informed that the Sandbox was on private HOA land, so the city had no jurisdiction unless a major safety hazard emerged. For the first time in a long while, Karen felt powerless. Her usual tactics, threatening letters and detailed citations, seemed ineffective against a project that was not only sanctioned by the HOA, but widely adored by residents. Meanwhile, the Tanners considered what to do with their vandalized turtle sandbox. The plastic turtle shell was still salvageable after a thorough scrubbing, though the inside needed replacement sand. Toby occasionally asked if they could fix it so he could have his own personal sandbox at home. Martin was tempted to reinstall it, out of principle, but he was wary of provoking another late-night sabotage. Julie felt the same. In the end, they decided to store the clean turtle box in their garage. Toby could play in it occasionally under supervision, but given the brand-new community sandbox that was just a short stroll away, they focused their energies on that shared space. They did, however, install motion sensor lights and a security camera near their side yard. Should anyone attempt more nighttime mischief, they would now have video evidence. Martin quietly suspected Karen was behind the vandalism, but without proof, he found a peaceful path forward more valuable than open conflict. At the next monthly HOA meeting, Mr. Caldwell placed the community sandbox on the agenda, praising it as a prime example of neighborly cooperation. I'm pleased to report that families are enjoying the new amenity, and we've received positive feedback overall, he said. We might consider adding more communal spaces in the future, like a small gazebo or barbecue area. Applause rippled through the audience. Karen refrained from clapping. She raised her hand. While the sandbox has proven popular, I'd still like to bring up concerns about potential noise and cleanliness. Do we have protocols for quiet hours or sanitary checks? Rena Hall, a fellow board member, responded. Parents have been diligent. They come with their own toys, keep the area tidy, and supervise their kids. As for noise, we don't have evidence of it being disruptive beyond normal daytime activities. Karen pursed her lips. Fine, I just want to ensure the rules are followed. Mr. Caldwell gave a reassuring smile. Rest assured, we have a volunteer team checking the sandbox weekly. Nothing so far has required formal intervention. It was official. The sandbox was not just tolerated, it was celebrated. Even the board recognized that Karen's complaints were largely unfounded. She sat there, simmering in quiet resentment, while the rest of the room commended the Tanners and other volunteers who brought the vision to life. As word of the Sandbox success spread, so did a subtle shift in how neighbors viewed Karen. Before, many had been intimidated by her fervent enforcement. Now, they saw that collective action could neutralize her demands. People began pushing back on other petty complaints she filed. They realized if a large group opposed her, the HOA board would listen to the majority. For Karen, this was a humbling experience. She still patrolled the neighborhood, but residents met her with either polite indifference or firm pushback. The sparkle of authority she once wielded had dulled. Occasionally, she'd lecture a homeowner about leaving a hose rolled out on the lawn, only to be met with calm defiance. Unless the covenant explicitly forbids a hose for more than 5 minutes, Karen, we're fine, they'd say, referencing the thick binder of rules. People began reading the covenant more thoroughly, using it against her attempts at overreach. With a new community sandbox as a beacon, families felt more welcome to let their children play outdoors. Sidewalk chalk drawings reappeared, flowers, rainbows, hopscotch lines. Kids rode scooters and bikes, greeting passing neighbors cheerfully. The sense of warmth and openness that once lay dormant under Karen's oppressive enforcement now bubbled up. Martin and Julie saw Toby thrive. He made new friends, other toddlers who loved sitting in the sandbox, sharing toy trucks, and building sand cities. On weekends, the Tanners sometimes stayed out until dusk, chatting with fellow parents while the kids played under the glow of street lamps. A neighbor even strung up fairy lights around a nearby tree, adding to the cozy ambience. Karen, feeling outnumbered, retreated to her usual strategy, photographing anything she perceived as a violation. But her once powerful influence had diminished. People who received her letters or emails would simply forward them to the board with a note. Is this an actual infraction or Karen's personal preference? More often than not, the board responded with a neutral stance, effectively ignoring her complaints. Though the Tanners had set up a security camera in their yard, months passed without incident. Perhaps Karen feared being caught in the act, or perhaps she had resigned herself to defeat. Either way, the sabotage that started it all remained officially unsolved. Then, one afternoon, an elderly neighbor named Mrs. Albertson decided to come forward. She had difficulty sleeping on the night of the vandalism and happened to glance out her window around midnight. She saw a woman pushing a wheelbarrow filled with dirt, heading toward the Tanner side yard. Mrs. Albertson didn't have clear vision at a distance, but she'd recognized the distinctive silhouette of Karen's short haircut. When Mrs. Albertson learned about the vandalism the next day, she suspected Karen but feared retaliation if she spoke up. Now, seeing how the neighborhood had banded together, she confided in Martin. I can't say it was her face, dear, but the posture, the hair, the stiff way of walking. I'm quite certain it was Karen. Martin wasn't surprised. He thanked Mrs. Albertson for telling him. He considered confronting Karen or taking it to the board, but without a photo or more conclusive evidence, it would remain hearsay. In the end, Martin decided that with the community sandbox a success, it wasn't worth sparking another war. Let Karen stew in the knowledge that her sabotage had backfired. He and Toby already had the best outcome they could hope for. After months of a large community sandbox thriving, Toby asked one day, "Can we bring back our turtle sandbox too?" Martin and Julie considered it. With the security camera in place and the neighborhood support, they decided to give it a try. They filled the turtle with fresh sand, placing it in a slightly more private corner of their yard, still visible to the camera, but far from the sidewalk. Toby, overjoyed, scooped up the sand with miniature cups and built little towers once more. Karen inevitably passed by. She glared at the turtle's sandbox from behind the property line. When she noticed a few grains of sand on the grass, she snapped a photo, presumably to file yet another complaint. But the Tanners, anticipating this, had placed a short edging around the sandbox area. No rules were violated. A few days later, Martin received a single-sentence email from Karen. Please be sure your new sandbox installation remains contained. He answered politely that they had everything under control. No further letters arrived. As summer rolled around again, the idea of a neighborhood block party circulated. The volunteer committee proposed holding it near the community sandbox, turning the area into a festive gathering spot. They set up a grill, coolers of beverages, and a canopy for potluck dishes. Kids could play in the sand while adults mingled. Flyers went up around Brookfield Greens, inviting all residents, Karen included. Though some doubted she would attend, they felt it necessary to extend an olive branch. On the day of the event, laughter and music filled the air. Families brought foldable chairs, teenagers helped organize games, and an inflatable bounce house appeared on a neighbor's lawn. To the surprise of many, Karen showed up. She wore pressed khaki slacks and a pastel blouse, carrying a tray of homemade brownies. People greeted her cautiously, but politely. She maintained her aloof demeanor, yet she stayed for over an hour, observing the lively atmosphere. At one point, she walked near the sandbox, brownies in hand, and watched the children squealing with delight as they built a giant sand fortress. Toby noticed her and waved a sandy hand. "Hi," he called. Karen offered a stiff smile, perhaps unsure how to respond to such unguarded friendliness. Then she placed the tray of brownies on a nearby table and slipped away into the crowd. Following the block party, a subtle shift occurred in Karen's behavior. She didn't transform overnight. She still filed the occasional complaint about minor issues. But she seemed less aggressive, more contained. Maybe it was because she realized the residents stood united, or perhaps the block party chipped away at her resistance to normal family life. The HOA board, in turn, began to focus on positive projects rather than constant enforcement. They announced a plan to spruce up the community garden with more benches and possibly a small water feature. Residents felt they had turned a corner, moving away from pettiness and towards collaboration. Martin sometimes reflected on how a single act of vandalism, dumping soil over a toddler's sandbox, had sparked a collective reaction that benefited everyone. He and Julie remained grateful for their neighbors who came to Toby's defense. The Tanners no longer felt like newcomers. They had become integral members of a growing network of friends. One breezy autumn evening, Martin and Julie took Toby for a walk around the neighborhood. The leaves had begun to change color, painting Brookfield greens in shades of red and gold. They strolled past the community sandbox, which was still in regular use. Several kids were busy burying toy cars in the sand, giggling. They paused to say hello to the parents, then continued on. As they passed Karen's house, Toby pointed. "That's the lady who doesn't like sand." Martin and Julie exchanged a wry smile. They saw Karen standing on her porch, sipping tea. She raised a hand in a half-hearted wave, which they returned. No hostility lingered, only the faint memory of past conflicts. Life rolled on, more peacefully now. At home, Toby dozed off after a warm bath. Martin sat in the living room, browsing photos from the block party on his phone. One picture captured the moment Toby grinned beside the new sandbox, arms full of sand toys, with a circle of kids around him. In the background stood the group of dads who built it, each sporting a proud smile. "This is what a community should be," Martin murmured to Julie, who nodded in agreement. "We might not have found this sense of unity without Karen's sabotage forcing us to come together." Months turned into years. The Turtle Sandbox remained a fixture in the Tanner's side yard, seldom disturbed, well protected by lighting and security cameras. Meanwhile, the community sandbox took on a life of its own, upgraded over time with additional benches, a play structure, and a sign that read, "Brookfield Green Sand Park for big imaginations." New families moved in, drawn by the friendly neighborhood vibe. They heard stories of a meddlesome Karen who once tried to extinguish children's play. But by then, the legend felt almost mythic, a cautionary tale about the power of neighbors banding together against overreaching authority. Karen herself remained in Brookfield Greens, continuing her rigid routines, though with less sway. Some said she privately lamented the community's shift toward child-centric activities. Others believed she had mellowed slightly, content to live in a place that, while not as orderly as she wanted, still maintained decent property values and outward charm. In an odd twist, the sandbox, initially targeted by Karen's destructive impulses, became a symbol of Brookfield green spirit. If you visited on a sunny weekend afternoon, you'd see families chatting, kids laughing, and a sense of warmth that pervaded even the crisp suburban air. Parents would often joke, "We owe this sandbox to Karen. If she hadn't dumped soil on that little turtle, none of this might have happened." Such is the irony of life in a suburban HOA community. One person's determination to remove an eyesore can spark a wave of solidarity that brings neighbors closer together. In trying to rid the neighborhood of a toddler's sandbox, Karen inadvertently created a beloved fixture that would remain for years. A covered sand oasis, free from her meddling, officially endorsed by the HOA she had once wielded like a weapon. And so, Brookfield Greens carried on, with children's laughter echoing along its walkways. The Turtle Box, restored, was simply Toby's backup spot for lazy days. But the real attraction was the giant sandbox the community had built, a testament to what happens when neighbors unite against intimidation. Though Karen would forever be known as the one who dumped soil over a toddler's sandbox, her legacy in Brookfield Greens would remain overshadowed by the unstoppable force of community spirit.